Why is work so terrible? Survey after survey tells us that people don't like their jobs, they don't like their managers, they don't like their companies, a lot of times they don't even like their coworkers. So why is work so bad? I'm going to answer that question, but first I want to ask you a different question. Why do you have a brain? I know it sounds like a weird question, but I think it leads us to the answer of why work is so terrible. Here's what we know. I'm sitting here recording this, and at some point in time in the future, you're sitting there watching it. And that means that our ancestors did something right. They successfully had little ancestors before they got eaten. Now, being eaten doesn't sound like a big deal right now, but remember, 2-3 million years ago, it was a really big deal because we're not that strong and we're not that fast. And there were a lot of things that could use us as a meal. And so being able to protect ourselves and being able to survive long enough to have other little humans was pretty crucial to being able to have the species survive. So how did we do that? Because I'm sitting here and you're sitting there, so our ancestors did that really well. They did it because they could predict the future. And that, in fact, is why you have a brain. Your brain is designed to help you predict the future. Predicting the future doesn't mean like picking the right stock. What it means is your ancestors, going back generation after generation after generation, could effectively avoid the places and times and situations that would get them eaten or put them in some sort of danger. And in order to do that, they had to be able to predict what was going to happen and when it was going to happen. They had to be able to predict the future. And so it was critical for the survival of our species to have brains that could predict the future. Now, how do our brains do that? The world is hugely complex. Even 2-3 million years ago on the savannas of Africa, the world was an amazingly complex place, and it's only gotten more complex since then. And our mind can't possibly deal with all that complexity. There's no way that our mind at any point in time could possibly deal with everything going on around us. Right now, I'm sitting in a room and there's lights and people and microphones and cameras and there's all sorts of things happening, and there's no way my brain can take in all that information. So what my brain gets really good at doing is figuring out what to pay attention to and what to ignore. You could think of it as like filtering. Some stuff gets through, a lot of stuff gets thrown out. And those filters are based on what we call mental models. Our brain has built a representation of the world, a representation of what it thinks the world should be doing, how the world should behave, how the things and people and situations and objects around us should behave. And so that model is really the thing we're working with. We're not working with the outside world, we're working with our model of the outside world. And that model is a beautiful thing. In fact, I'm sitting here right now, so that means my model has worked pretty well so far. But it's not perfect. In fact, it has a lot of problems with it. And one of the problems it has is that if something happens in the outside world that doesn't match what we expect, doesn't match our model, it causes us a lot of trouble. It causes something called cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance is when you expect one thing and you get another. Cognitive dissonance is the brain's kryptonite. It can't stand it. It has to make sense of what's going on. And so if it's in that cognitive dissonance state, if it's constantly looking at something and saying, well, I expect one thing, but I'm getting another, it has to close the gap between what it expects and what it's experiencing. And the way it closes that gap, which is deeply troubling and deeply painful to your mind and to my mind and to everybody's mind, is it makes up stories. It makes up stories. It has to rationalize what's going on. And the stories it makes up, like any good story, are mostly fiction. They really aren't what's happening. It's what makes us feel good about what is happening. So if someone was to come up to you and approach you in the street and your expectation is they'll be nice and friendly, and all of a sudden they start screaming at you, you have immediate cognitive dissonance. That has to be closed. That dissonance has to be closed. And so your mind starts making up stories. This person is a bad person. this person is off their rocker. They're not together emotionally. There's big problems going on with them. When in fact, there could be a lot of other stories that are true about why this person is yelling at you. They could be warning you about an impending problem, such as, hey, I'm yelling at you to get your attention because there's something about to fall on your head. But your brain isn't taking all that in. It just filtered this thing, it's gone into dissonance, and it started to make up a story about what's going on. This process, which we at Talentism call the confusion loop, is an enduring feature of your day-to-day experience. It isn't a weird thing that happens once in a while. It's happening all the time. And some days it's happening in little ways, some days it's happening in big ways, but it's happening all the time. And what happens is when we have this cognitive dissonance and we have this gap and then we tell this story, we start to modify our behavior based on that story. We start to act differently because now our internal model, our narrative, is something different than where we started. So the guy comes up to you and he starts yelling at you, and then you start thinking, this guy's a jerk. What an idiot. I can't believe he's yelling at me. So what do? You start yelling back at him. Now he's confused. He all of a sudden expects you to get that he's trying to save you from an impending disaster, and instead you're yelling back at him. So what does he do? Cognitive dissonance. Creates a story. Now you're the problem. And so rather than yelling at you to try to save you from some impending disaster, he instead is now yelling at you because he thinks you're a jerk. Well, now you're totally confused because you thought by yelling at him that you were going to actually get him to calm down, and now he's getting amped up. And these loops start playing with each other again and again and again, amplifying situations to the point where either there's total emotional breakdown, complete collapse of the situation, or you leave just completely intransient and entrenched in your point of view. A point of view which is wrong. So these confusion loops are going on all the time in our existence. They're going on all the time in our work. So you've got a brain to be able to predict the future, but there's times it doesn't predict it well. And when it doesn't predict it well, it creates the opportunity for confusion. And confusion is the thing that causes us the most problem at work. We expect when we go into work that we're going to be treated a certain way, that our boss is going to give us certain opportunities, that the company we're working for is going to be a good company, that we're going to be fairly rewarded for our work. We expect hundreds of different things about the world of work, but the world of work is changing rapidly. It's moving all the time. Just a generation ago, full-time employment was something that was seriously considered and seriously sought after by many people. Now, full-time employment is something that's sort of a myth, and it's rapidly going away even more. And so you've got this rapidly changing world of work, but our brain, trying to predict the future, is predicting a future that isn't there, and we're confused when it isn't happening. And rather than seeing that we're confused in that situation, we make up a story about our own virtue and about everyone else's vice, about how we are the victim of a situation and are being treated unfairly, when in fact there can be many times where there could be even greater opportunity for us. There could be even greater possibility for us in the world of work, but our brain can't see it. It's filtered that opportunity out. And we're telling ourselves stories that probably aren't true. Now, your situation, of course, is unique, and I can't possibly comment on whether you're going through something terrible or not. I don't know that. But what I do know is that it's a feature of humanness, of us and our minds and our brains, to consider things as real that really aren't. To consider things as self-evident that in fact are just complete illusions that we've made up in our head. And as long as that exists, what we're going to end up with is more and more confusion. And we're going to end up with more and more people who are telling others, including people who take surveys, that they don't like their job, and they don't like their coworker, and they don't like their boss, and they don't like their company, and they feel lost. And that's an inevitable part, an inevitable conclusion to how we're designed, to what our brains are like. So the next time you're at work and you're thinking about how terrible work is, and maybe it is, but at least create a sliver of opportunity in your mind, a possibility of reflection, that maybe you aren't seeing things as they really are. Not that it's your fault, it's just the way you're designed. And so create an opportunity, because this is also a feature of the design of your mind. Create an opportunity to reflect and think about what you're missing. What are the opportunities for you to find your big four at your current work? What are the things that you do that you love? The people who you work with who you think are extraordinary? What are you missing because you are confused? Now, hopefully, this will be helpful to you to understand how, as you're building your big four, there are things all around you for you to be able to learn from that'll enable you to fill in that picture we talked about last week, as well as find the work you love. But always keep in mind, as a feature of your mind, that you exist because you have a brain, and your brain could predict the future, and it can't always do that well. And when it does it poorly, you may hate work because of it. Thank you very much for your time. I hope this has been helpful for you. And as always, I look forward to your comments at info@talentism.com. Thanks.